How does a man wake up one morning and decide to destroy the world he built with his own hands? How does love, once the purest emotion, twist into domination, and domination into death? Chris Watts and Chad Doerman were not born monsters. They were fathers, husbands, men who went to work, paid bills, and tucked their children into bed. To the world, they looked ordinary, but inside, something was breaking, a quiet fracture spreading through their minds like a hidden fault line. For Chris, the danger hid behind a smile. For Chad, it thundered through every word he spoke. One killed in silence, the other killed in rage. Yet both were driven by the same hunger, control. This isn't a story about madness. It's a story about erosion, how ordinary men lose empathy, piece by piece, until the people they once loved become reflections of everything they hate. Tonight, we go inside the minds of two fathers who cross a line between love and destruction. This is the story of inside the minds of two killers. Before the headlines, before the police tape, before the world called them monsters, they were just two fathers living quiet lives in two different corners of America. Chris Watts in Colorado, Chad Doerman in Ohio, both surrounded by family, both seen as ordinary, both standing at the edge of an unseen collapse. Neighbors remember smiles, waves, small talk about weather and work. There was no warning sign, no blood in the air, no violence in the open. Evil rarely begins with noise. It begins with silence, a silence that hides disappointment, resentment, and fear. Chris Watts' life looked picture perfect. A suburban home, a wife who adored him, two little girls whose laughter filled every room. On social media, Shanann posted videos of family trips, birthday parties, new beginnings. In every frame, Chris stood beside her, quiet, smiling, seemingly proud. But the man behind that smile was drifting away. At work, he was dependable. At home, distant. He spoke less, felt less, became less. Inside him, a hollow space was forming, and he didn't know how to fill it except with control. Shanann felt the distance long before anyone else did. Her text to friends show a woman fighting to keep her marriage alive, worried, hopeful, exhausted. She believed love could still fix things. But love can't fix someone who has stopped believing in it. Chris wanted peace, his version of it. A world without conflict, without expectation, without responsibility. He didn't want to change his life. He wanted to delete it. Hundreds of miles away, Chad Doerman was living his own version of disintegration. He wasn't polished or polite like Chris. He was unpredictable, a man whose emotions switched without warning. One moment laughing with his children, the next yelling at the smallest mistake. His home carried the weight of tension that no one talked about. Family stress, financial strain, sleepless nights. But those were just surface cracks. Underneath lived something darker, an anger without outlet, a need for power he couldn't sustain. Friends later said they saw signs, a look in his eyes that felt empty, a tone that chilled conversation. But we don't call those things danger. We call them bad days. That's how denial protects us. It lets us believe storms will pass if we stay quiet long enough. Chad's rage was slow burning, but constant. He wanted to feel respected, in charge, obeyed. When life refused to bend his control, anger became his language. Every outburst fed the next, each louder, each closer to the edge. Two men, one hiding behind politeness, the other drowning in fury, moving toward the same void. Both felt powerless in different ways. Chris hid his powerlessness under calm smiles. Chad disguised it with loud commands. But both were reacting to the same wound, a fractured ego. The more they lost emotional connection, the more they clung to dominance. And when dominance becomes the only way to feel alive, empathy dies quietly in the background. Psychologists call this emotional constriction, a gradual shutting down of feeling to avoid pain. The problem is, what starts as protection turns into poison. Without emotion, conscience weakens. Without conscience, destruction feels logical. By the summer before the crimes, both households carried invisible pressure. In Colorado, Shanann planned another baby, believing it would bring them closer. In Ohio, Chad's family tried to maintain normalcy, unaware of the storm forming behind his blank stares. To outsiders, everything looked fine. But inside those homes, silence had become weapon. Every unsaid word was a spark waiting for air. The night before it happened, Chris lay next to Shanann, rehearsing in his head the life he wanted. The life without her. He told himself it wasn't hate. It was freedom. He imagined the fair, the fresh start, the peace. He ignored the reality sleeping inches away. The woman who loved him, the children whose futures depended on him. And in Ohio, Chad sat awake, unable to sleep, trapped in a loop of thoughts that blurred into violence. Every sound in the house irritated him. Every memory twisted into resentment. He wasn't planning, not consciously, but anger doesn't need plans. It just needs opportunity. 2 homes, 2 fathers, 2 storms, one silent, one loud, about to break. The next sunrise would look ordinary to everyone else. But inside those houses, the world was already ending. Morning light spilled through 2 different windows in 2 different states. One in quiet Frederick, Colorado, the other in rural Claremont County, Ohio. And in both homes, everything looked ordinary. Coffee brewing, children waking, a father moving through routine. But normality can be the cruelest disguise, because no one suspects a storm when the air feels still. Chris Watts, acting the part. August 13th, 2018. The day began like any other. Chris was left home for work, wearing his company polo, steel-toed boots, and that same polite smile his co-workers had seen 100 times before. He texted Shanann nothing unusual. He waved to a neighbor's camera. And behind that calm rhythm, he was living 2 lives at once. At work, he was admired, the quiet man who never complained. To his friends, he seemed patient, balanced, loyal. But inside his mind, every word, every gesture, every movement was performance. He wasn't being Chris Watts anymore. He was playing him. When people live double lives, psychologists call it cognitive splitting, the ability to compartmentalize morality so deeply that guilt never touches fantasy. Chris perfected it. He could imagine murder in the morning and eat lunch with coworkers hours later without a single tremor in his voice. He texted Nicole Kessinger, the woman who had become his escape, words of affection while police searched for his missing family. To him, deceit wasn't chaos, it was control. Every lie was a stitch in the mask he wore, and the more he smiled, the tighter it fit. Chad Doerman, the calm before the noise. June 15th, 2023. In Ohio, Chad Doerman sat quietly at breakfast. Neighbors later said they saw him outside that morning, still expressionless, watching his sons play in the yard. Nothing seemed wrong. No argument, no shouting, no sign of rage. That's the danger of simmering anger. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simply waits. Chad had spent weeks spiraling in private frustration, financial strain, domestic tension, sleepless nights that blurred into intrusive thoughts. His anger had become routine, familiar, almost comforting. Each flare-up reset his sense of control. But that morning felt different. There was no shouting, no release. Just the kind of stillness that hides violence behind it. He moved through small tasks. Feeding pets, checking his phone, unlocking the safe. Those gestures would later mean everything. But at the time, they looked ordinary. The world gives no warning when ordinary turns fatal. Masks built from habit. Both men were functioning inside the illusion of everyday life. Chris still talked to co-workers about fuel readings and job sites. Chad still texted friends short replies that sounded normal. Routine became camouflage. Psychologists call this behavioral normalization, when the body repeats patterns that convince the mind everything is fine. But beneath that repetition, emotion drains away. Both men had stopped feeling their lives. They were simply performing them. That detachment is what makes these stories terrifying. They weren't overtaken by sudden madness. They reached a point where empathy no longer interfered with intention. They could smile through the countdown. Chris, the performance unravels. That evening, after pretending to search for his family, Chris stood before news cameras. He folded his arms, swayed slightly, and told reporters he just wanted them to come home. To the untrained eye, he looked composed. To behavioral analysts, every gesture screamed deception. Arms crossed for self-comfort. Shifting weight for anxiety, eye contact held too long. He thought he was acting. His body told the truth. Within 24 hours, his mask would crack under interrogation lights. Chad, the storm arrives. In Ohio, the mask didn't crack. It shattered. Neighbors would hear gunfire, screaming, chaos. There was no performance, no plan to deceive. Chad Doerman's mask was built from anger, and when anger broke, there was nothing left beneath it. What began as silence turned to thunder. In seconds, the image of a father became the reality of a killer, the moment before collapse. Two men, two endings, one of lies, one of rage, yet both driven by the same hunger for control. Chris tried to control perception. Chad tried to control life itself. Neither succeeded. Because control is an illusion, it only lasts until reality demands truth. That's where their stories converge. In the split second between mask and collapse. A moment where every suppressed emotion returns at once, and the human mind finally shows what it has become. For Chris, that moment happened under the cold lights of an interrogation room. For Chad, it happened in the deafening echo of gunfire. And from that point forward, both men would live in the aftermath of their own making. The line between control and collapse is thin, almost invisible. It doesn't break with a scream. It breaks with decision. And once crossed, there's no way back. Chris Watts, The Night of Silence. It was still dark in Frederick, Colorado, when Shanann watched return home from her business trip. The clock read just after 2 a.m. She walked to the front door, tired but relieved, unaware she was stepping into the final hours of her life. Chris was awake. He'd waited, not out of love, but out of calculation. In the quiet of their bedroom, a conversation began that no one else would ever hear. Shanann wanted to fix their marriage. Chris wanted to end it. His voice calm, hers trembling. Minutes later, calm turned into violence. The details are hard to say out loud, but the psychology behind them is colder than the act itself. Chris wasn't raging. He wasn't shouting. He was detached, methodical. He strangled the woman who had trusted him, believing that by doing so, he could erase the problem and start over. It was a predatory moment, not impulsive. The kind of violence born from planning, not passion. Psychologists call this instrumental aggression, harm used as a tool to achieve a goal. And his goal was freedom. When Shanann's life ended, Chris didn't collapse or panic. He cleaned up. He moved carefully through the house, checked his phone, and looked in on his daughters. To him, it was just the next step in a plan he thought he controlled. But control built on lies always ends in chaos. By sunrise, he had loaded Shanann, Bella, and Celeste into his work truck. He drove for miles, not away from guilt, but toward a desperate illusion of order. At an oil site, surrounded by emptiness, he carried out the rest of the unthinkable. When it was over, the silence he wanted finally surrounded him. But it wasn't peace. It was absence, the void left when empathy dies completely. Chad Doerman, The Day of Thunder. 900 miles away in Ohio, another father was losing control. Not slowly, but all at once. June 15th, 2023. A bright afternoon. The neighborhood calm. And then, without warning, the first shot. Chad Doerman's rage had been building like pressure in a sealed room. For weeks, maybe months, he'd rehearsed thoughts he never dared to speak. Resentment, frustration, the feeling that life was against him. When anger replaces logic, the brain enters a primitive state called affective aggression, emotional violence driven by impulse, not reason. That's where Chad lived in his final moments as a father. He retrieved his rifle, loaded it, and turned it against his sons, the very children who trusted him most. Witnesses would later describe the screams, the chaos, the disbelief of neighbors running into the street. No warning, no negotiation, just thunder. In that instant, Chad became the embodiment of uncontrolled emotion, the opposite of Chris's cold precision. Where Chris erased quietly, Chad destroyed loudly. But both acts were the same expression of power, the final, desperate attempt to feel in control of a life slipping away. When police arrived, he didn't flee. He didn't lie. He simply sat on the porch and said the words that still haunt every officer who heard them. I did it. There was no remorse in his voice, only exhaustion, as if rage had drained every remaining part of his humanity. Silence and thunder. Two fathers. Two different forms of the same destruction. Chris killed in silence. Chad killed in thunder. But both shared a chilling truth. Each believed in that moment that what they were doing made sense. That's what separates these men from monsters in fiction. Monsters know they're evil. These men convinced themselves they weren't. Chris told himself it was mercy, freeing Shanann and the girls from a future of lies. Chad told himself it was fate, a moment he couldn't stop. Different words. Same delusion. After every family annihilation, the question echoes. Why? But the mind of a killer rarely gives one answer. It gives fragments, pieces of justification, shame, and emptiness that never fit together. For Chris, guilt would arrive slowly in pieces. For Chad, it never arrived at all. The moment after, when the noise stopped, when the adrenaline faded, both men were forced to face the aftermath. Chris standing alone in his spotless kitchen, staring at the clock as if time could rewind. Chad sitting on his porch, silent, the rifle cooling beside him. One hid his crime. The other confessed immediately. Two paths to the same place. Collapse. And yet, even here, the psychology diverged. Chris still believed he could control the narrative. He rehearsed explanations, practiced tears, convinced himself he could outsmart the truth. Chad didn't try to hide anything, not because of honesty, but because there was nothing left in him to protect. His mind was spent. His identity burned away. Both forms of collapse reveal the same truth. When empathy dies, reason becomes weaponized. The human mind can justify anything once it stops feeling. The psychology of the breaking point. Forensic psychologists studying both men would later find striking contrasts in method, but identical patterns in motive. Each felt trapped. Each saw family not as love, but as limitation. And each sought release through control. Chris sought control through planning, detaching emotions, eliminating obstacles, constructing a false peace. Chad sought control through dominance, forcing his world to obey in the only way he knew how. In both cases, violence was not madness. It was logic distorted by ego. That's what makes the breaking point so terrifying. It isn't an explosion of insanity. It's a moment of terrifying clarity. When a person finally acts on a lie they've been rehearsing for years. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Chris was arrested 2 days later, his lies unraveling with every interview. Chad was taken into custody within minutes, already numb, already gone. And as their hands were cuffed, both men did the same thing. They stopped fighting, because deep down they both knew the same truth. They had already lost everything long before the first act of violence began. When the noise faded, the silence began. But silence doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it's the sound of a mind collapsing in on itself. Both men, Chris Watts and Chad Doerman, had crossed the threshold. Their families were gone. Their homes were crime scenes. And for the first time, they were alone with the reality they created. Yet what they did next reveals the most chilling truth about who they really were. Chris Watts, the performer without an audience. Chris didn't run. He didn't cry. He cleaned. He organized. He rehearsed. In those hours after murders, he wasn't acting like a man in shock. He was acting like a man directing a scene. He texted Shanann's phone, called her friends, and even invited the police inside his home. Every action carefully measured. Every emotion simulated. He wasn't trying to fix what he'd done. He was trying to manage it. That's how deep his control went. Even in the aftermath of horror, he still believed he could steer perception. When police asked questions, his tone stayed calm, even casual. He smiled, repeated phrases like, "I just want them home," and spoke in the past tense without realizing it. Each lie was a desperate attempt to keep his world from collapsing. For psychologists, this is a textbook example of narcissistic self-preservation, the instinct to protect image even when the self is already destroyed. Chris has spent years defining himself through how others saw him. Without that reflection, He had no identity left. So he built another lie, layer by layer, believing that if he acted innocent long enough, the truth will become optional. But truth doesn't vanish. It waits. And when the polygraph exposed him, when the officer said, "You already know the results," the mask cracks for the first time. You can see it in the footage. His jaw tightening, his breath catching, his body stiffening in that split second of realization. He was no longer in control. And control was all he had ever known. Chad Doerman, the void after rage. For Chad, there was no mask to hide behind. When deputies arrived, he was sitting outside, the gun beside him, his shirt stained, his face expressionless. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't argue. He simply said, "I did it." Those 3 words were not confession in the emotional sense. They were release. After the storm of rage, there was nothing left inside him but exhaustion. Officers later said he looked vacant, as though he had already left his own body. That's what psychologists call post-violence dissociation. When the brain shuts down to protect itself from what it's done. It's not guilt, it's emptiness. He answered questions quietly, using detached phrases like "they're gone and it happened," language that erases the self from the act. That kind of speech shows a mind severed from reality, where events feel like memories instead of choices. But make no mistake, Chad knew what he had done. He just no longer knew who he was. 2 prisons, 2 realities. Within hours, both men were behind bars. Chris in a holding cell under bright lights. Chad in a small county jail, surrounded by silence. And yet, both behaved as though they were still in control. Chris adjusted his posture, folded his clothes, asked guards about routines. He needed structure because structure meant power. Even in captivity, he couldn't stop managing the environment. Chad did the opposite. He withdrew completely, barely spoke, barely moved. When questioned, his eyes stayed fixed on the wall. No tears, no reaction, just the flat stillness of a man who turned himself off. 2 men, 2 prisons, 2 different ways of coping with the same void. One filled the silence with pretense. The other let silence consume him whole. Psychology behind the aftermath. What happens to the mind after violence depends on what fed it in the first place. Chris's violence came from deceit, so his aftermath became performance. He constructed a story, hoping to outthink guilt. Even his later confessions were scripted, small admissions wrapped in self-justification. He didn't cry for his family. He cried for being caught. Chad's violence came from emotion, so his aftermath became numbness. He didn't seek to hide. He sought to feel nothing. He confessed quickly, not because of honesty, but because silence was easier than words. His emptiness wasn't peace. It was collapse. Psychologists describe both as pathways to detachment, different roads leading to the same psychological end, the loss of self. When the masks finally shatter, days later, the lies and the silence began to rot. Chris's story crumbled under evidence. Text records, GPS data, security footage. Every piece of proof stripped away another layer of his illusion. By the time he confessed, there was no emotion left, only calculation. He even tried to control how the truth was told, asking officers to keep it private, as if reputation still mattered. Chad's mask didn't shatter, it dissolved. In custody, he barely spoke. His interviews were short, mechanical, detached. He didn't try to explain why. He didn't seem to know himself. To the world, they looked like opposites, one deceptive, one honest. But in truth, they were mirrors, each using control in a different form to survive the aftermath. Chris clung to image, Chad clung to oblivion. And in both cases, what remained was not humanity, but vacancy, the human mind after destruction. When people hear these stories, they often ask, how can a person live with what they've done? The answer is simple but horrifying. They don't live with it. They live beside it. They create psychological distance, a space between the act and the self, and convince themselves they're 2 different people. That's what Chris and Chad did in those first days of confinement. They separated from their crimes the way a snake sheds its skin. But what they didn't understand was this. You can't escape what's inside your own mind. The silence they created outside became the echo they heard within. No noise, no escape, just a looping thought. The realization that control, the one thing they worshipped, was gone forever, and as night stretched into days, as the world moved on and headlines faded, both men faced the same haunting question. Who am I now? A father? A killer? A man? A void? There was no answer, only the hum of fluorescent light and the quiet sound of breathing. Inside two separate cells that would never open again. The first week after confession is the hardest, not because of guilt, but because of noise. Keys turning, doors clanging, voices echoing through concrete halls. For the newly imprisoned, that sound is a reminder. You no longer decide when anything begins or ends. For Chris Watts and Chad Doerman, that loss of choice was the beginning of their psychological collapse. Chris Watts, becoming the narrator of his own fall. Inside Weld County Jail, Chris tried to hold on to identity the only way he knew, by performing. He smiled at deputies. He thanked staff. He asked about workout schedules and reading material. Every gesture screamed a single message: I'm still a good man. He began journaling, writing letters to strangers who reached out to him. Some were curious, others were sympathetic. Chris answered each one with the same polite rhythm he once used on Shanann. He described prayer, reflection, repentance, but always centered on himself. Even his remorse had an audience. Psychologists call this ego preservation through narrative. When reality destroys self-image, some people rebuild that image through story. Chris turned his prison routine into a new performance, swapping family man for a redeemed sinner. It wasn't healing, it was branding. When asked about the murders months later, he spoke in the same calm tone he used in interviews before arrest. He said, I feel like God has forgiven me. He talked about peace, forgiveness, and transformation, but never about empathy. That absence is key. Remorse is about others. Forgiveness is about self. Chris's focus stayed exactly where it had always been. Chad Doerman, the vanishing self. In Ohio, Chad's decline was different. He didn't perform. He withdrew. Within days, he stopped eating regularly. He refused television, refused conversation. He stared at walls until guards tapped the bars to check if he was awake. Forensic evaluators who met him described flat affect. No emotion, no engagement. His answers short, monotone, mechanical. Asked about the shootings, he said, I don't know why. Asked if he regretted it. He said nothing. That emptiness wasn't courage or defiance. It was collapse, a total shutdown of the emotional system. Psychiatrists sometimes call this identity diffusion, when the self fractures under unbearable awareness. Unlike psychosis, it's not delusion, it's an absence of self. The mind protects itself by ceasing to participate. Chad's world shrank to a few square feet and the hum of fluorescent light. His silence became his final act of control. If he said nothing, no one could define him. But silence can't rewrite memory. The mind remembers, even when it refuses to speak. And in those long nights, memory was the only thing left to keep him company. When reflection becomes punishment, time moves differently in a cell. Days bleed into nights. The calendar loses meaning. Without external purpose, the mind starts to feed on itself. For Chris, that meant analysis, replaying events, rewriting details, seeking moral loopholes. For Chad, it meant erasure, pushing memory deeper until thought itself became unbearable. Both patterns destroy identity, because identity lives in connection to family, to society, to empathy. Remove those and the self dissolves. What remains is only habit, a body performing the motions of survival, letters, dreams, and ghosts. Months later, Chris wrote about seeing Shanann in dreams. He claimed she smiled, forgave him, told him to be at peace. To believers, it sounded like repentance. To psychologists, it was guilt displacement, the subconscious creating forgiveness when the conscious mind cannot earn it. It was another layer of self-protection. If Shanann forgave him, then he could keep existing without collapse. Chad's dreams, according to jail reports, were nightmares. He woke shouting, disoriented, sometimes crying without understanding why. He refused therapy. He refused clergy. He told one evaluator, "It doesn't matter anymore." That sentence marks the point where identity finally breaks. When nothing matters, the self is gone. The world moves on, they remain frozen. Outside the prison walls, news cycles shifted. New crimes, new tragedies. But for Chris and Chad, time stayed still. Their names faded from headlines, but inside, their stories replayed endlessly. Loops of justification, shock, and emptiness. Chris began reading the Bible obsessively, underlining passages about redemption and judgment. He wrote in margins, "I still have purpose." Purpose is a fragile illusion, but it's the last defense against despair. Chad stopped writing altogether. His case awaited trial, but emotionally, he was already serving a life sentence inside his own mind. No plan, no voice, just a mechanical passing of hours. What collapse really looks like. Collapse doesn't always look dramatic. It's not screaming or tearing clothes or pounding walls. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's a man folding his blanket precisely every morning because it's the only thing he can still control. Sometimes it's another man staring at nothing because the alternative is remembering. Both of them experience the same psychological death, the end of identity. One replaced self with performance. The other erased self completely. Both were ghosts long before their sentences were handed down. And in that truth lies a haunting lesson. Monsters aren't created by chaos alone. They're created by emptiness, a slow, quiet death of feeling that finally consumes the person who once lived there. When people hear stories like these, they always ask the same question. How could a father do that? How could anyone? But the real question isn't how they did it. It's how they didn't see it. Because neither Chris Watts nor Chad Doerman believed they were evil. Even now, behind bars, they don't fully understand what they became. That's what makes their story so chilling. Not the violence itself, but the absence of awareness that surrounded it. The mirror of normalcy. We want killers to look different from us. Monstrous, alien, clearly broken. But in truth, they often look like our neighbors, our co-workers, the man smiling in a family photo. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it mimics normal life so perfectly that even the person wearing it can't tell the difference. Chris Watts woke up every morning believing he was a good person trapped in a bad situation. He didn't see himself as cruel, only misunderstood. He convinced himself that ending his family was an act of release, a way to fix what felt broken. That's the psychology of moral disengagement. When people twist morality until it serves their needs. He wasn't angry at Shanann, not in his own mind. He was angry at the pressure she represented, the reflection of himself he could no longer control. When he killed her, he wasn't punishing her. He was erasing the image of the man he could no longer pretend to be. Chad Doerman's reasoning was less articulate, but no less warped. He didn't rationalize through logic. He justified through despair. He saw himself as powerless, cornered by life, unseen, unimportant. His violence wasn't planned. It was the eruption of that self-pity turned inside out. He wanted control, and in his mind, destruction was control. That's what links them. Not evil intention, but emotional blindness. They couldn't see beyond themselves. And when empathy disappears, morality follows it into the dark. The ordinary face of evil. In psychology, there's a concept called the banality of evil. The idea that the most horrifying acts are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people doing what seems reasonable in their own distorted logic. Chris Watts didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a neighbor helping with groceries. Chad Doerman didn't sound like a villain. He sounded like a tired father under stress. That's the terrifying truth. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. It comes with justification. Both men used stories to protect themselves from truth. Chris told himself, "I just wanted peace." Chad told himself, "It just happened." One narrative polished, the other broken, both designed to protect the ego. Because in the end, evil isn't about wanting to hurt others. It's about refusing to see others as real. The psychology of moral erosion. No one becomes a killer overnight. It starts with small compromises. A lie here, a burst of anger there. moments when conscience whispers don't, but the mind finds a reason anyway. Over time, each justification dulls the moral senses until empathy fades, responsibility weakens, and emotion turns mechanical. Chris didn't go from husband to killer in one night. He became one by degrees. Every time he lied, every time he withdrew, every time he chose silence over honesty. Chad's path was different but parallel, each outburst teaching him that control comes from fear, not love. Each small victory over others feeding a larger failure within himself. That's how moral erosion works. It's not one big decision. It's 1,000 small ones that go unnoticed until there's nothing left to save, seeing themselves as victims. Even after their crimes, both men saw themselves as the victims. Chris said, "I felt trapped." Chad said, "I couldn't stop it." Each sentence removes responsibility and gives power to circumstance. That's called externalization, the mental defense that blames fate instead of choice. It's comforting because it turns guilt into tragedy. And in tragedy, even the villain feels like the hero. That's why neither man feels truly guilty. Because to feel guilt, you first have to recognize others as real, as separate, as human. And both men, long before they killed, had stopped doing that. Their families had become extensions of their frustration, not people with their own inner worlds. In killing them, they weren't destroying others. They were destroying reminders of everything they couldn't control. Why they don't feel what we expect. We expect remorse to follow horror. We want tears, breakdowns, redemption. But remorse requires empathy, and empathy requires identity. By the time both men confessed, their identities were gone. They didn't feel like themselves anymore. They felt like observers, detached, watching, replaying. That's why their confessions sounded flat, emotionless, unreal. To them, it was unreal. Because people like Chris and Chad don't understand evil as moral choice. They see it as inevitability, something that just happened, a story written without their consent. That's why they can talk about it without collapsing. The act has already become a separate thing, disconnected from self. Evil as absence, not presence. We imagine evil as an active force, a dark energy that consumes people. But in reality, evil often begins as absence. The absence of empathy, reflection, love. It's a void that grows quietly, almost peacefully, until it swallows everything else. Chris's evil wasn't fire, it was ice, stillness, calculation, the death of warmth. Chad's evil wasn't cunning, it was chaos, noise, anger, the death of restraint. Both forms lead to the same place, emptiness. Because once compassion is gone, anything becomes possible, the unseen danger. That's why these stories matter. Not because they're rare, but because they show how fragile morality can be when left unguarded. You don't have to be a killer to understand their path. Every time someone chooses ego over empathy, pride over honesty, silence over truth, they take one small step down the same road. Chris Watts and Chad Doerman are extreme outcomes of ordinary patterns. The need to control, the fear of losing image, the anger of feeling powerless. Magnify those emotions. Remove empathy. Add isolation. The result is horror. It's not madness that creates killers. It's the slow corrosion of humanity. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Because it means anyone could erode if they never stop to see who they're becoming. The world remembers the names of killers. But what deserves remembering are the lives they took, the laughter, the warmth, the small moments that defined who they were. Because behind every headline about Chris Watts and Chad Doerman are 8 lives bound together by trust and destroyed by its betrayal. Their names are not statistics. They are echoes. Shanann Watts, Bella, Celeste, baby Nico, Clayton, Hunter, Chase. 7 lives, stolen by 2 men who should have been their protectors. Each name is a story unfinished. Each memory, a lesson left behind. What these stories teach us. When we talk about these cases, it's tempting to see them as isolated horror. Monsters born in chaos, men suddenly losing control. But the truth is quieter. Both tragedies began long before the violence. They began in silence, in disconnection, resentment, and the slow erosion of empathy. Evil doesn't arrive as a scream. It whispers. It hides behind calm smiles, polite excuses, and the illusion of normalcy. Chris didn't start with rage. He started with distance. He stopped talking, stopped connecting. He let silence replace communication until empathy ran dry. Chad Doerman didn't start with planning. He started with anger. He let frustration become identity, and identity became dominance. And when control slipped away, he mistook violence for strength. That's why these stories matter. Because evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion, like bitterness, like silence that lasts too long. The fragile thread of control. Control is the illusion that drives both love and destruction. Healthy control sets boundaries. Unhealthy control tries to own. Chris tried to control how others saw him. The perfect husband, the calm father, the dependable worker. When his image began to crumble, he turned control inward, toward the people who threatened to expose his failure. Chad's control was louder. He demanded obedience, demanded quiet, demanded that life bend to his moods. When it didn't, rage became his only language. Different methods, same psychology. Control without empathy always collapses. Because the moment we treat others as extensions of ourselves, we begin to justify their pain for our comfort. The warning signs we miss. Both families showed early signs that something was wrong. But society often overlooks emotional danger until it becomes physical. Withdrawal, blame, sudden isolation, unusual calm before confrontation, explosive anger without reason. These are not personality quirks. They are warning signs of emotional fracture. Too often we see the surface, a smile, a job, a quiet routine, and assume peace. But silence is not peace when it hides resentment, and anger is not passion when it hides despair. If someone had asked harder questions, if someone had looked past the polite smiles and nervous jokes, maybe these families would still be alive. That's not blame. That's awareness. Awareness as prevention. Prevention doesn't begin in courtrooms or prisons. It begins at home. It begins in conversations we're too afraid to have about stress, resentment, mental health, and control. We tell men to be strong, but never teach them how to be vulnerable. We tell families to stay together, but never show them how to communicate when love starts breaking. We let silence fester because it feels easier than conflict. And in that silence, darkness grows. The truth is, connection saves. The moment someone feels seen, the moment they are truly heard, the illusion of control begins to lose its grip. That's why empathy is not weakness. It's defense. It's how we disarm the unseen storms before they explode. The responsibility we all share. Every person who watches, listens, or talks about these stories becomes part of the solution. Because awareness spreads through attention, and attention saves lives. If you see a friend withdrawing, reach out. If you see a family member consumed by anger, speak gently but honestly. If you feel disconnected yourself, ask for help before the silence becomes dangerous. Intervention doesn't always stop evil, but it reminds the lost that they are still seen, and sometimes that's enough to change the ending. The smallest conversation can be the loudest act of care. Empathy is a resistance. Empathy doesn't excuse horror. It prevents it. It's how humanity pushes back against the corrosion that made men like Chris and Chad possible. Every time you choose compassion over indifference, you chip away at the culture that normalizes emotional neglect. Every time you ask, "Are you okay?" instead of saying "you'll be fine," you break the chain of silence that allows destruction to grow. Empathy is not about forgiveness. It's about vigilance. It's the refusal to look away, honoring the victims. For Shanann Watts, love was never performance. It was devotion. Her children were her pride, her purpose, her reason to wake up smiling. The videos, the posts, the laughter, they weren't vanity. They were proof of life. For Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, love was childhood itself. Running through yards, laughing in the sun, believing the world was safe as long as their father was near. That innocence is what was lost. Not just the children, but the trust that home means safety. So when we remember their names, we remember the joy they carried, not the fear that ended them. Because to truly honor victims, we must protect what they represent: love, safety, and connection. The final reflection. These stories are not just about the fall of two fathers. They are about the consequences of emotional blindness, of choosing silence over truth, control over love, and ego over empathy. And maybe the reason we keep telling them is not because we want to understand evil, but because we want to understand ourselves. How far could we drift before we stop seeing others as real? How easily could any of us let pride replace compassion? And what would it take to notice that drift before it's too late? The answer lies in awareness. Because awareness is what keeps us human. It's what separates protection from destruction, love from control, and care from complacency. So if these stories haunt you, let them. Because the moment you feel that ache, that discomfort, that sorrow, it means empathy is still alive inside you. And that's how we make sure tragedies like these never repeat. Not by turning away from darkness, but by facing it together with eyes open and hearts still capable of feeling. The world remembers the names of killers, but what deserves remembering are the lives they took, the laughter, the warmth, the small moments that defined who they were. Because behind every headline about Chris Watts and Chad Doerman are 8 lives bound together by trust and destroyed by its betrayal. Their names are not statistics. They are echoes. Shanann Watts, Bella, Celeste, baby Nico, Clayton, Hunter, Chase. 7 lives, stolen by 2 men who should have been their protectors. Each name is a story unfinished. Each memory, a lesson left behind. What these stories teach us. When we talk about these cases, it's tempting to see them as isolated horror. Monsters born in chaos. Men suddenly losing control. But the truth is quieter. Both tragedies began long before the violence. They began in silence, in disconnection, resentment, and the slow erosion of empathy. Evil doesn't arrive as a scream. It whispers. It hides behind calm smiles, polite excuses, and the illusion of normalcy. Chris Watts didn't start with rage. He started with distance. He stopped talking, stopped connecting. He let silence replace communication until empathy ran dry. Chad Doerman didn't start with planning. He started with anger. He let frustration become identity, and identity became dominance. And when control slipped away, he mistook violence for strength. That's why these stories matter. Because evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion, like bitterness, like silence that lasts too long. The fragile thread of control. Control is the illusion that drives both love and destruction. Healthy control sets boundaries. Unhealthy control tries to own. Chris tried to control how others saw him. The perfect husband, the calm father, the dependable worker. When his image began to crumble, he turned control inward, toward the people who threatened to expose his failure. Chad's control was louder. He demanded obedience, demanded quiet, demanded that life bend to his moods. When it didn't, rage became his only language. Different methods, same psychology. Control without empathy always collapses. Because the moment we treat others as extensions of ourselves, we begin to justify their pain for our comfort. The warning signs we miss. Both families showed early signs that something was wrong. But society often overlooks emotional danger until it becomes physical. Withdrawal, blame, sudden isolation, unusual calm before confrontation, explosive anger without reason. These are not personality quirks. They are warning signs of emotional fracture. Too often we see the surface, a smile at job, a quiet routine, and assumed peace. But silence is not peace when it hides resentment, and anger is not passion when it hides despair. If someone had asked harder questions, if someone had looked past the polite smiles and nervous jokes, maybe these families would still be alive. That's not blame. That's awareness. Awareness is prevention. Prevention doesn't begin in courtrooms or prisons. It begins at home. It begins in conversations we're too afraid to have about stress, resentment, mental health, and control. We tell men to be strong, but never teach them how to be vulnerable. We tell families to stay together, but never show them how to communicate when love starts breaking. We let silence fester because it feels easier than conflict. And in that silence, darkness grows. The truth is, connection saves. The moment someone feels seen, the moment they are truly heard, the illusion of control begins to lose its grip. That's why empathy is not weakness. It's defense. It's how we disarm the unseen storms before they explode. The responsibility we all share. Every person who watches, listens, or talks about these stories becomes part of the solution. Because awareness spreads through attention, and attention saves lives. If you see a friend withdrawing, reach out. If you see a family member consumed by anger, speak gently but honestly. If you feel disconnected yourself, ask for help before the silence becomes dangerous. Intervention doesn't always stop evil, but it reminds the lost that they are still seen, and sometimes that's enough to change the ending. The smallest conversation can be the loudest act of care. Empathy is a resistance. Empathy doesn't excuse horror. It prevents it. It's how humanity pushes back against the corrosion that made men like Chris and Chad possible. Every time you choose compassion over indifference, you chip away at the culture that normalizes emotional neglect. Every time you ask, "Are you okay?" instead of saying, "You'll be fine," you break the chain of silence that allows destruction to grow. Empathy is not about forgiveness. It's about vigilance. It's the refusal to look away, honoring the victims. For Shanann Watts, love was never performance. It was devotion. Her children were her pride, her purpose, her reason to wake up smiling. The videos, the posts, the laughter, they weren't vanity. They were proof of life. For Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, love was childhood itself. Running through yards, laughing in the sun, believing the world was safe as long as their father was near. That innocence is what was lost, not just the children, but the trust that home means safety. So when we remember their names, we remember the joy they carried, not the fear that ended them. Because to truly honor victims, we must protect what they represent. Love, safety, and connection. The final reflection. These stories are not just about the fall of two fathers. They are about the consequences of emotional blindness, of choosing silence over truth, control over love, and ego over empathy. And maybe the reason we keep telling them is not because we want to understand evil, but because we want to understand ourselves. How far could we drift before we stop seeing others as real? How easily could any of us let pride replace compassion? And what would it take to notice that drift before it's too late? The answer lies in awareness. Because awareness is what keeps us human. It's what separates protection from destruction, love from control, and care from complacency. So if these stories haunt you, let them. Because the moment you feel that ache, that discomfort, that sorrow, it means empathy is still alive inside you. And that's how we make sure tragedies like these never repeat. Not by turning away from darkness, but by facing it together with eyes open and hearts still capable of feeling. Until the next truth. If you're still here, thank you for listening. These stories are never easy to hear, and they shouldn't be, because every time we talk about darkness, we remind ourselves that awareness is the light that stops it from growing. The cases of Chris Watts and Chad Doerman are not just about murder. They're about the fragile line between love and control, between silence and truth. If you learn something from this story, if you believe awareness can save lives, please share this video. It helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them before it's too late. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories, where every week we look deeper into the human mind, not to glorify evil, but to understand it. Because only when we understand the darkness can we truly protect the light. This is Dark Truths, and I'll see you in the next story.